Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kim Strassel and Joe Sternberg. And just, Kim, I wanted to ask you about the Fed's analysis of what went wrong with regulation in the failure of Silicon Valley Bank. It was released Monday, I believe, by Michael Barr, the head of Fed supervision. And it was, I have to say, a classic of the Washington genre. It looked at the Fed and said, well, yes, mistakes were made. Some of the supervisors weren't as aggressive as they should have been, and looking at the mistakes, oversights of the bank managers at Silicon Valley Bank. But you know what? It really was the fault of Congress that passed this change in the Dodd-Frank bill in 2018, 2019 that sent the wrong signal and didn't give us enough authority to supervise these regional banks. And then, oh, by the way, my predecessor, Randall Quarles, he had sent a message that we weren't just supposed to be aggressive enough. No evidence in the report that what Quarles had actually done and how it had affected the calculations of the supervisors. And third, hey, by the way, we at the Fed, we'd like some more power to regulate.
Right. We totally messed this up. Give us more power.
Yeah, and when regulation fails, regulators always ask for more power to regulate. It's an iron law of Washington.
One of the things that was remarkable about that report, Paul, is it was basically like a report of innuendo, right? Finger pointing and innuendos, vague suggestions that, as you said, Congress sent the wrong signal. But what you didn't have in there was any concrete evidence of anything other than the Fed being asleep at the switch. It could describe it any way it wants to. But, it wasn't able to suggest that there was a direct line between any action in Congress and what happened here. It could not even suggest that it was lacking in the ability to look at what was going on. It admitted that this was happening in plain sight, and it didn't do anything about it. And yet it's impossible for government agencies to ever just truly say, we messed up. We messed up, and here's what we need to do better next time. So as you say, a classic of genre, it was, we messed up. It's everybody else's fault that we messed up. And by the way, we need even more powers to mess up bigger in the future.
Yeah, the miracle would be if they said, we messed up, and because we messed up, we think we should have less power and less authority. When that happens, I'll faint dead away. Joe, interesting politics going on, though, about the Fed, and two Republican candidates, Ron DeSantis and in particular Vivek Ramaswamy, have criticized the Fed in recent weeks. Vivek Ramaswamy this week writing in the Wall Street Journal that he plans to make the Fed an issue in his campaign, and scoring the Fed for the mistakes it's made over the last 20 years or so in monetary policy, which I think are undeniable. But he made a contribution by going through them, right? Periods of excessive liquidity and then excessive tightening, not really following the proper lodestar for making sure that we can track the proper level of inflation or look at where problems and how problems are developing in the financial sector. My own view is that this was a good contribution, and you can debate specifics here or there, but teeing this up as an issue, I think, is a useful contribution to the debate. And we certainly, the Fed has sort of had a kind of sovereign immunity politically here for a long time. And I think that those days should be over.
Yes. I think that what too often happens is that the Fed and other central banks around the world, to be fair, will try to cloak themselves in this notion of central bank independence to suggest that they should be completely free of any kind of political pressure. And yet, certainly as the Fed has become more activist in policy terms, it inevitably is involving itself in the economy in ways that become more and more political. So you should expect some oversight of that. And I think it certainly has been the case from time to time over the years that the Fed has come in for various forms of political scrutiny. What I thought was so important about what Vivek is saying here is that he's going much beyond what the normal form of criticism is. I mean, the normal political critique of the Fed would be relatively superficial. It would be, you guys made the wrong judgment calls at this point or that point, and that's why inflation is so high today. He's going further than that. He's saying the way that the Fed views the economy and the way that the Fed understands their job is completely wrong. They have come to think of their role in terms of targeting a 2% inflation rate and smoothing out business cycles, and that's absolutely the wrong mindset for them, that they need to focus on dollar stability as a way of achieving their price stability mandate and putting the economy on a sound footing. And, that is perhaps a bit of a subtle point, especially for, lay voters who have better things to do with their time than parse the details of all of this. But I think that's a very important discussion to have, and it's good that Republicans are looking for ways that they can start making these political points and explain to voters why this is actually important.
Yeah, I think that's going to be interesting to follow. And it makes Ramaswamy and DeSantis in contrast to Donald Trump, because Trump, of course, appointed Jerome Powell, who has presided over the inflation revival at his time in the Fed. And he's generally, Donald Trump, been a very easy money guy, weak dollar, let it rip sort of guy. But that has dangerous consequences. Kim, just before we go, I wanted to ask you about the politics of the debt limit. Joe Biden has invited the big four congressional leaders to the White House next week for a meeting, even as he and the White House spokesman and the Democratic leaders of the House say, we're still not going to negotiate. So come to meet, but we're not going to negotiate over the debt level until you surrender and pass a clean debt limit, and then we'll maybe talk about some spending things. But of course, the Republicans don't want to do that because then they give up the leverage they have. Where are we in this negotiation? As Janet Yellen says, the debt limit will be reached as early as June 1st.
Yeah, my own view is that not much has actually changed here, not since Kevin McCarthy and the House passed, obviously, their own bill to hike the debt ceiling, coupled with a number of important spending reforms. Yes, you've seen Joe Biden now inviting all the members to the White House next week. Notably, by the way, all of them, not just Kevin McCarthy, even though Kevin McCarthy is the person he needs to speak with, the only head of a party that has actually passed a bill that raises the debt ceiling. Right now, the Senate isn't really involved in this at all, but you can tell the White House did this because they didn't want to look as though they were acceding to McCarthy's demand that they have a conversation. Instead, the White House would invite who it chose to invite, and they'd all show up there. But the broad dynamics are no different. As you say, Senate Democrats and the White House resolutely claiming that they will not pass any sort of spending reform, that they must have a clean debt ceiling hike. And my view is that the calculation is still the same here. They're going to try to walk out the clock. I think that Yellen announcement about hitting this even sooner, while it may be accurate, was also part of a plan to try to jam Republicans to say, look, time is running out. We don't have time for all of these negotiations you claim you want. You need to give us what we want. And of course, they're offering all these soothing noises saying, well, if you just pass the debt ceiling, we'll sit down with you and come up with some sort of broad spending cuts, reforms, and packages as part of the overall appropriations process. I mean, no one in the Republican conference believes that, nor should
I don't think any Democrats actually believe that.
No, of course they don't. No, it's completely nonsense. They just don't want to have to cut a dime. So they're going to try and jam them. So this, in some ways, is sort of a high-stakes game of chicken here. Who's going to blink? And you now have Hakeem Jeffries in the House saying he's going to try to put together a discharge petition. This is a way to go around the leader, and if he could get all of his members and 5 Republicans to sign on, they could get it on the floor and pass it. I don't know if he can actually manage that at the moment. Republicans are sticking together, but this is still a game of blink.
Yeah, pretty risky business by the White House, particularly with this House majority. I mean, I think their playbook has been played out before with the Republicans running for cover at the last minute and Senate Republicans bailing them out. But I'm not sure it's going to work this time because Mitch McConnell going to have to deliver something like 9 or 10 votes to get something through a clean debt limit through the Senate. I'm not sure he could actually do that, even if he decides he wants to. So it's going to be, I think, touch and go. And for the administration, they're basically toying with potential default here. Because if there's a miscalculation and they think, okay, we can play this game they will blink. Well, what if they don't? So I think the White House is going to have to sit down at some point and negotiate. I saw that John Tester, the Senate Democrat from Montana, who's running for re-election this year, has now joined Joe Manchin in saying that the White House should, in fact, negotiate a deal. So there's going to be pressure building here on the administration, even as it tries to say the only pressure should be on House Republicans. All right, Kim and Joe, thank you so much. I just want to say one more word to our listeners. Our reporter, Evan Gershkovich, is still in prison in Russia on false charges of espionage, even though those charges have not been delineated at all. He is a political prisoner in essence and a journalistic prisoner unjustly held. We want everybody to keep him in mind. We're trying to do everything we can to get him out, pulling every lever we possibly can. And we're going to keep his name and his predicament in the public eye as much as possible. So thank you all for listening. We'll be back as usual with another edition of Potomac Watch tomorrow.